In late July 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump announced the termination of trade negotiations with Canada, imposing a 35% tariff on non-USMCA Canadian goods starting August 1, 2025, escalating trade tensions and threatening the USMCA agreement. The move was driven by disputes over Canada's digital services tax targeting U.S. tech giants, alongside allegations of Ottawa's failure to control fentanyl and maintain trade imbalances. Amid this crisis, Canada marked a historic milestone with its first LNG shipment from the LNG Canada facility in Kitimat, British Columbia on June 30, 2025, destined for Asian markets. This analysis delves into Trump's motives, Canada's response, the economic fallout, the strategic significance of LNG Canada, and the long-term implications in a competitive global landscape. 1. Trade tensions, tariffs, and political strategy. On July 11, 2025, President Trump declared on Truth Social an increase in tariffs from 25% to 35% on non-USMCA Canadian goods, effective August 1, 2025, targeting sectors like lumber, steel, aluminum, and autos. He accused Canada of failing to curb fentanyl, despite DEA data showing only 0.2% of illegal fentanyl in the U.S. originates from Canada compared to 80% from Mexico, maintaining trade deficits and imposing a 3% digital services tax on U.S. tech firms like Google and Amazon. Trump also threatened a 40% tariff on trans-shipped goods designed to evade duties and halted trade talks, stating, "Canada may just have to pay tariffs." This move is both an economic lever and a political strategy, reinforcing Trump's America First agenda ahead of the 2026 midterm elections, targeting voters in industrial states like Wisconsin, dairy, Michigan, autos, and Idaho, lumber, by shifting focus from domestic inflation to unfair trade by Canada. USMCA-compliant goods are exempt, but the broad scope of the 35% tariff threatens Canada's key industries such as lumber, $14 billion in U.S. exports, steel, aluminum, and autos. By ending negotiations, especially after Canada's retaliatory tariffs, Trump signals a readiness to escalate tensions to unprecedented levels, putting the USMCA, once hailed as his historic achievement, at risk. The question remains, is this a calculated push to force Canadian concessions, or a gamble that could ignite a full-scale trade war? 2. Canada's response: defiance, adaptation, and unity. Prime Minister Mark Carney responded forcefully, dismissing the fentanyl accusations as unconvincing and emphasizing Canada's progress in drug control while pledging cooperation with the U.S. In a July 26, 2025 speech, Carney declared, "Canada will not bow to pressure. We will protect our farmers, businesses, and national interests." Canada maintained 25% retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion CAD, $20.6 billion USD, of U.S. goods since March 4, 2025, targeting items like wine, coffee, and household goods, and is considering expanding to 155 billion CAD, including electric vehicles, steel, and aluminum from U.S. battleground states like California and Florida. To mitigate economic damage, Canada implemented several measures: business support, temporary tax exemptions, March 4th, October 15th, 2025, for businesses reliant on U.S. goods, deferred corporate taxes and GST, HST until June 30th, 2025, and a 40 billion CAD liquidity injection to support affected industries. Domestic unity. The government launched a Buy Canadian campaign to boost local consumption and sought new markets in Asia and Europe. However, with 68% of exports tied to the U.S., diversification faces challenges. Legal action. Canada filed a WTO dispute on March 13, 2025, accusing the U.S. of violating USMCA and WTO rules. However, the lengthy process makes this unlikely to resolve before the deadline. Domestically, Ontario Premier Doug Ford called for 50% retaliatory tariffs on U.S. steel and aluminum, while opposition leader Pierre Poilievre proposed a Canada First plan focusing on tax cuts and resource development to reduce U.S. dependency. Anti-American sentiment is rising, with 91% of Canadians supporting reduced economic reliance on the U.S., underscored by incidents like the booing of the U.S. national anthem at an Ottawa hockey game. 3. Economic impact, fallout, and global instability. The trade tensions are causing widespread economic disruption and global uncertainty. Canada. Key industries. The lumber industry, $14 billion in U.S. exports, 30% of U.S. construction supply, loses competitiveness with the 35% tariff, pushing firms like Canfor and West Fraser toward crisis. Steel, aluminum, and auto sectors face similar pressures, with U.S. exports, 68% of total exports, down 10% since May 2024. Macroeconomy. The Bank of Canada warns of a permanent GDP decline if business investment weakens. The CAD lost 6% in value post-Trump's announcement, raising import costs and inflation. Social and political. Rising nationalism fuels campaigns for economic self-reliance and diversification, but heavy U.S. dependence limits rapid shifts. United States. Cost of living. Lumber price hikes increase home building costs by $7,000, $12,000 per house, notably in Texas and Georgia. Food prices, especially dairy, rise 15–20%, hitting low-income families hardest. Inflation could rise 1 to 2%, potentially pushing CPI to 4% per World Bank forecasts. Financial markets. The S&P 500 fell 0.4% and Nasdaq 0.2% on July 11, 2025, reflecting investor fears of a trade war. Household living costs are projected to rise by $1,300 annually. Small businesses. Senators like Susan Collins backed the Canada Act to exempt small businesses reliant on Canadian goods, but rising prices threaten domestic markets. Global impact. Domino effect. Brazil and Russia may fill Canada's lumber and aluminum gaps, but at higher costs. The EU and Mexico, facing U.S. tariffs, 30% and 25%, fear a global trade war. Financial instability. European stock indices dropped 1.3% in July 2025. The USD fluctuates sharply. The IMF and OECD lowered 2025 global growth forecasts, warning of recession risks if trade tensions persist. 4. LNG Breakthrough, Canada's strategic pivot. Amid the trade storm, Canada achieved a historic milestone with its first LNG shipment from LNG Canada in Kitimat, British Columbia, on June 30, 2025, bound for Asian markets like Japan, South Korea, and China. The $40 billion CAD project, Canada's largest private investment, breaks the country's reliance on the U.S. market, where 8.8 billion cubic feet of natural gas daily, $8 billion USD, was exported in 2024. Powered by hydroelectricity to reduce emissions, the facility has a 14 million ton annual LNG capacity, with plans to double to 28 million tons if Phase 2 is approved. Strategic significance of LNG Canada. Market diversification. From Kitimat, LNG ships reach Asia in 10 days, half the time of U.S. Gulf Coast routes via the Panama Canal. This accesses fast-growing markets like Japan, planning 20 million tons year additional LNG imports from 2026, South Korea, expanding LNG storage 50%, and China, the world's fastest-growing LNG market. Direct Asian access reduces Canada's reliance on the U.S., its sole gas market for decades. Geopolitical leverage. Seaborne exports allow Canada to negotiate more confidently with the U.S., mitigating risks from policies like tariffs. LNG ships can redirect to friendlier ports, ensuring stable revenue despite U.S. tensions. Economic and social benefits. The project created 50,000 jobs during construction, signed $5.8 billion CAD in contracts with indigenous businesses and includes the Haisla Nation as an equity partner in the 700-kilometer coastal gas link pipeline. This indigenous partnership model sets a new standard for Canadian resource projects. Environmental commitment. Powered by British Columbia's hydroelectric grid, LNG Canada is among the lowest emission LNG facilities globally. Partners, including Japan, Malaysia, China, Dow, and Shell, invested in high-efficiency equipment and methane reduction technologies, positioning Canada as a green LNG supplier as the EU considers carbon border taxes. Challenges for LNG Canada: cost and terrain. Building in remote Kitimat, with harsh weather and rugged terrain, inflated costs compared to U.S. Gulf Coast facilities. Canada's stringent environmental and safety regulations further extended timelines and expenses. Subsidy controversy. British Columbia's carbon and sales tax breaks sparked debate over public funding for fossil fuel projects, especially given Canada's climate commitments. Expansion pressures. Phase 2, aiming to double capacity, requires tens of billions in investment, facing high interest rates, potential cost overruns, and scrutiny from climate-focused investors. FIF, global competition and Canada's opportunities. Canada enters a fiercely competitive LNG market. Qatar plans to reach 126 million tons a year by 2030, solidifying its global dominance. United States, the top LNG exporter, leveraging shale gas and flexible contracts, including short-term and spot market deals. Australia, a major Asian supplier, modernizing facilities and exploring new gas basins. Emerging players, Mozambique, Tanzania, and the Eastern Mediterranean offer lower-cost LNG and proximity to certain markets. To compete, Canada must expand infrastructure. Projects like Cedar LNG and Kasai Lisam's LNG, involving indigenous partnerships, could diversify export points and boost capacity. Focus on green LNG. Investments in carbon capture, methane leak sensors, and renewable energy use will align with EU carbon tariffs and Asia's demand for cleaner fuels. Maintain public trust. Transparency on emissions, independent environmental monitoring, and honoring indigenous commitments are critical to avoiding social and legal backlash. 6. Conclusion. From trade crisis to energy opportunity, Trump's 35% tariff and termination of trade talks have pushed U.S.-Canada relations to the brink of a trade war, threatening USMCA stability and causing severe economic fallout. Canada faces GDP declines, currency devaluation, and industry crises, while the U.S. grapples with rising home prices, inflation, and market instability. Yet Canada's first LNG shipment from LNG Canada marks a strategic pivot, reducing U.S. dependence, accessing lucrative Asian markets, and positioning Canada as a potential global energy powerhouse. With pioneering indigenous partnerships, environmental commitments, and international collaboration with partners like Japan and South Korea, Canada is transforming trade adversity into an opportunity for energy independence. Despite challenges from global competition, high costs, and climate pressures, LNG Canada underscores Canada's ambition and adaptability. In a tense geopolitical landscape, Canada is charting a path toward a sustainable, flexible, and independent energy future, redefining its role on the global stage.